In the last lecture, I looked at the thought of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the impact of his writings and the inspiration they were for the movement which later scholars refer to as Romanticism within the artistic and cultural world. But I ended by asking the question that what happens if the assumption of Rousseau, and in many ways the assumption of the Romantics, this idea that nature itself has some kind of meaning, what happens if that disappears? What happens if all there is really is this world that has no meaning intrinsic to itself? And that's really the situation we get to in the 19th century. And I want to spend this class, this lecture and the next lecture looking at the thought of two particular individuals who wrestled with that idea. First is Karl Marx, German philosopher and revolutionary political thinker, and the second will be Friedrich Nietzsche, also a German philosopher, and in many ways just as, if not more, revolutionary than Marx. Both men have this in common. They were wrestling at some level with an interesting problem. And the interesting problem was this: why, after the Enlightenment had effectively put the sword to traditional religion, why, after the Enlightenment had really made traditional religion culturally and intellectually implausible, was religion so persistent? Why did people continue to believe in things that Marx and Nietzsche and their elite intellectual contemporaries would have regarded as little more than fairy stories or fables? And though Marx and Nietzsche come up with different answers to that question, they both approach it in a similar way. What they did was they wrestled with the question in terms of human psychology. Mentioned a couple of times already in this short course, the significance of psychology, the way we think, the way we relate to the world from our inward being, our inner being, is very important. And Marx and Nietzsche both approached religion in terms of trying to find out what psychological function it fulfilled that meant that it persisted long after they considered it to have become intellectually incoherent and irresponsible. First, a bit of background on Karl Marx. His dates, 1818 to 1883. He's buried, as it happens, in Highgate Cemetery in the north of London. Though he was a German philosopher, he spent his later years in London researching and working in the British Library, and was buried in Highgate Cemetery. When he was buried there, Friedrich Engels, his financial supporter and co-labourer in the communist cause, made a speech where he essentially said, Marx dies today, virtually unknown, but 50 years from now everybody in the world will have heard his name. Would have seemed ridiculous at the time, but of course, as we now know, Karl Marx and the movements which his writings and life inspired did become dominant features of the 20th century and transformed the world as it was. He's most famous in terms of his literary work for the Communist Manifesto and for the great work of economics Das Kapital. He inspired communist regimes, China, Soviet Union, Cuba. But here, it's not his revolutionary politics, nor is it his economics that I wish to reflect on. I want to reflect upon his philosophy, because that takes us to the heart of what I'm trying to do in this short course. And there are two things I want to put up front about Marx's philosophy before we go into to dive into his thinking on religion. First thing to notice about Marx is he's a radical materialist. Remember that term I used in the first lecture, the immanent frame? The idea that reality can be understood purely in terms of the material world in which we live. Well, that's Marx's world. That's Marx's world in spades. For Marx, the world is immanent. There is no transcendence. More than that, the material conditions of life for Marx, specifically economic relations, shape how people think of reality. In other words, for Marx, the way you think is profoundly shaped by where you fit in to the economic structure of society at large. And that affects everything. It affects everything you do. It affects everything you believe. Think, for example, of morality. If you were to ask a Christian, why do you believe morally the things that you do? Probably the Christian would respond, well, because this is a human way of expressing the character of God. Thou shalt not kill, because God does not approve of killing. Thou shalt not commit adultery, because God is a God who is faithful to his people. There's a sacred, transcendent ground, if you like, for our morality that goes beyond this world. For Marx, no, that's not an option. For Marx, the world and everything in it has to be understood purely in terms of the world and everything in it. And that includes things like morality and moral codes. For Marx, moral codes are simply the ways by which the ruling class, those with power, keep others in their place and thereby protect and preserve their own privileged position in society. Morality, if you like, we might say, is a political tool for tricking people into behaving in the way that the rulers need them to behave in order to maintain their status as rulers. So the first thing to note about Marx is an absolute rejection of the transcendent. He is one of the great theorists, we might say, of the immanent frame. Secondly, Marx, at least the young Marx of the 1840s, was particularly interested in a concept of alienation. Alienation. What does it mean? Well, it's a sort of fancy way of saying he was interested in the concept of why, how and why men and women were somehow at odds with themselves. They somehow had that feeling of not fitting in, of not being comfortable or happy in the world in which they found themselves. We can think of simple examples of alienation, perhaps in our own experience. Maybe you remember being at school and you really wanted to be in with the in crowd, so you'd go over and you'd sit with the cool kids at lunchtime, and as you put your plate down on the dinner table, all of the cool kids get up and walk away and sit down at another table. And that makes you feel bad. At that point you feel out of joint. You feel that you don't quite fit in the world. There's an uncomfortability that comes with that. That's a form of alienation. And Marx is interested in why is it, if you like, that people are unhappy? What is it that prevents people from realizing their full potential, from being, we might say, at one with themselves? And of course, Marx is a materialist, though. So his answer to that question has to have a material answer. And Marx's answer is essentially this: man's dissatisfaction, man's feeling of alienation in this world is related to the fact that he is alienated economically. He doesn't enjoy, for example, the fruits of his labor because he's paid, say, minimum wage, and he never sees or enjoys that which he produces. Think of the person who works on the production line, putting a screw into a computer. All they do for endless days is put a little screw into a computer. They never take the computer home and enjoy it. What they take home is the minimum wage. And that doesn't make them feel satisfied with their life. They take no satisfaction from their work. They're alienated from their work. And this is an important concept because it really does lie in the background of Marx's understanding of religion. To put it simply, and I want to explain this in a little more detail, put it simply, for Marx, religion is a false, wrong answer to a real need. It reflects the fact that man is alienated from himself and the world, and it represents an attempt, a false, futile, failing attempt to overcome that. That also, of course, will have profound political significance, because it means that if one is to achieve utopia, if one is to achieve a world where people are no longer alienated, one must achieve a world where religion, as a function, as symptom of alienation, has no place. So, that's the background then. Let's now think in a little more detail about what Marx actually says about religion. Well, first of all, as I noted at the start, Marx is interested primarily in why people believe. The persistence of religion fascinates him. Marx is typical of a 19th century Enlightenment figure. He thinks that the Enlightenment and the great philosophers, Kant and company, have essentially debunked a lot of traditional religious belief. It's implausible. David Hume, for example, argued that he demonstrated the epistemological non-viability of religion, that belief in God could not be warranted. Marx assumes that. He also assumes that morality debunks Christianity as well. So, for example, the idea that there is a good God when there is so much suffering in the world seems incoherent. So, religion for Marx, he just assumes it's false and wrong. He's not in the game of proving such. That's where he starts. And as I've said already, he's a materialist. So he has no interest in the transcendent anyway. Very influenced, as it happened, by a contemporary German philosopher. Both he and Marx were, in their different ways, disciples of an earlier German philosopher, G.W.F. Hegel. This man called Ludwig Feuerbach. Feuerbach very much influenced Marx in that he had a very strictly materialist view of reality and applied that to his critique and understanding of religion. So the second aspect of Marx's thinking on religion is the role of this man, Ludwig Feuerbach. Feuerbach wrote a great work, The Essence of Christianity, in which he attempted to explain away Christianity, its life forms and its doctrines in purely materialist terms. And he sums up religion in this way, in this work, The Essence of Christianity, and I quote, "Religion, at least the Christian religion, is the relation of man to himself, or more correctly to his own nature, i.e. his subjective nature, but a relation of it viewed as a nature apart from its own. The divine being is nothing else than the human being, or rather the human nature purified, freed from the limits of the individual man, made objective, i.e. contemplated and revered as another, a distant being. All the attributes of the divine nature are therefore attributes of the human nature." Now you might be sitting there thinking, what on earth does all that mean? That has a kind of almost a gobbledygookish kind of feel to it. Well, we can express it very, very simply. Put simply, what Feuerbach says is this: religion is man's projection of his ideal self onto a being that he has invented outside of himself and calls God. In other words, you and I, we're alienated. We don't feel that we even rise to the level of the standards we set ourselves. We're dissatisfied, even with our own ability to be the people we want to be. So what happens in those circumstances is Feuerbach says, you know what you do? You project the ideal you out there, and you call it God, and you contemplate it and worship it. Religion, therefore, represents a function of alienation. It's because you're not who you want to be. It's because you feel dissatisfied. It's because you feel inadequate that you come up with this being of God that you project out there and worship. Human frustration leads human beings to project their aspirations onto a fictional character called God that then becomes a source for contemplation. Theological language may sound as if it's really about God, but we're actually talking about ourselves. That's the claim that Feuerbach makes. To say God is just, for example, is to say human beings should be just. To say God is merciful is to say human beings should be merciful. Where Marx will part with Feuerbach, of course, is this. Feuerbach doesn't do anything with this. Feuerbach really, he sees it as an explanation of religion, but then he leaves it to one side. What Marx says is that's not a fully adequate approach. If religion is the problem, if religion represents alienation, then the political struggle for the transformation of society must involve the dismantling or the demolition of religion. So, Marx, very influenced by Feuerbach, But when he comes to talk about religion, he wants to connect it to his radical political project as well. The famous statement by Marx, of course, is that religion is the opium of the people. And that's often taken to mean it's a sort of drug given by the rulers to keep the ruled passive, so they can be easily controlled and dominated by the rulers. In fact, Marx means something more profound in that statement, which only becomes clear when we set that statement within the context in which he first said it. It occurs in his work, A Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right. And it really does need to be quoted in full in order to understand what he's saying. And here I do so. Quote, "The foundation of irreligious criticism is man makes religion. Religion does not make man." That's Feuerbach. Religion is indeed the self-consciousness and self-esteem of man who has either not yet won through to himself or has already lost himself again. Again, that's Feuerbach. But then we move into the distinctive Marx. The struggle against religion is therefore indirectly the struggle against that word whose spiritual aroma is religion. What Marx is saying there is the attack on religion must therefore be central to the revolution that will transform the world. And he goes on. Religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and also a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. Therefore, the abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is actually the demand for their real happiness. End quote. Now notice three things about what Marx says here. First, as with Feuerbach, Marx sees religion as a human creation. There is no transcendence. There is no God out there for Marx. To the extent that we think he's out there, we're fooling ourselves. Religion is the result of psychology. It's the result of alienation. Specifically for Marx, of course, it's the result of the social conditions in which we live. And that's why it's so important. Secondly, it is driven by man's economic suffering. That's why it persists. Marx's basic argument is religion persists because men and women, boys and girls, suffer in this world. And as they suffer, they want to believe that their suffering has meaning and will be put right in the next world. That's an important point to make because one of the things that's often missed in talking about Marx on religion is this. Marx may despise religion, but he has tremendous sympathy for religious people in this passage because they're suffering. Notice what he says there. Religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Why are people religious? Because they're suffering. And what is religion? Well, it's a protest against real suffering. It's saying this is not how it should be. Notice he says this, it's the sigh of the oppressed creature. The typical religious person is oppressed. And religion is a sigh. It's the heart of a heartless world. It's an attempt to find some kind of meaning to the meaningless suffering that goes on in this world. It's the soul of soulless conditions. So even as Marx despises religion, I would like to say, he seems to understand that it represents real suffering of poor people. And that brings me to my third point. The third point is this. Marx believes that the criticism of religion, the destruction of religion, is central to the task of political revolution. Central to Marx's thinking is the working classes have to rise and overthrow the middle classes. How do you do that? Well, tragically, we might say, the working classes have to be uncomfortable. Their pain has to become unbearable. How, Marx argues, Marx thinks, does one make their pain unbearable? By getting rid of their false comforts. The polemic, the attack on religion is central to Marx's revolutionary thinking because it tears away the false comforts that dull the senses of the poor people. The criticism of religion, therefore, is central to the political project. Notice how central that is to many political projects today. The demolition of the standards and the life of traditional religion is very, very central to the heart of much of the radical politics we see unfolding in society around us. It may not have quite the same Hegelian or materialist shape that Marx gave it, but it stands in continuity with his basic thought on that point. So to conclude then, what can we say? Religious belief indicates some kind of inadequacy. Its persistence indicates a lack of development in the individual, a sickness within society. How often do we hear that kind of rhetoric today, that religion is retrograde and represents some kind of psychological inadequacy on the part of those who hold it? Find that in Marx. Secondly, therefore, religion needs to be debunked and abolished if ever true political freedom is to be achieved. For Marx, you cannot have true freedom. You cannot get rid of alienation unless you get rid of the symptoms of alienation as well. And thirdly, notice, underlying Marx's thinking, there is no transcendent reality. There's no intrinsic meaning to nature. The world can be explained in material, immanent terms. The supernatural and the transcendent for Marx, God and morality, are simply mystifications of material conditions that actually prevent you from seeing what is really there before your eyes. And that brings me then to the second champion of immanence and the second great repudiator of transcendent meaning, Friedrich Nietzsche. And it's to his thinking that we will address ourselves in the next lecture.